Well, I said I'd save the best to last, and I no doubt I have. I really appreciate this man, and feel very privileged that he has agreed to speak here today. Nick, I think, is the best export from England to Australia ever, but he's had a very distinguished 40-year career as a journalist, a broadcaster, an editor, and a think tank director, the Menzies Research Centre. And he's devoted so much time to resisting the spread of bad ideas, or at least that's what he says he's doing in his sort of, this phase of his life where he's no longer running a think tank day to day. But he writes a column every week in the Australian newspaper, which is a must read. It is a dose of common sense every week. You must read this column. He's very challenging, and he's a fellow host with me at Australian Digital Holdings TV, and we're privileged to have you today. Please welcome Nick Cater.
It is genuinely a tremendous privilege and honour to be invited to speak here in front of what I think is a very timely movement that you've begun here, Lyle, and your fellow directors and founders of this party. I congratulate you. I congratulate Jack Snelling, who I've been a friend for many years. I knew him as a Labor minister and used to talk to him at length about how he could make South Australia great again by being a better treasurer. But I think fundamentally the work he's involved in now is even more important, to be honest, because as Robert Menzies, the founder of the Liberal Party, has said on a number of occasions, there are things much more important than pounds, shillings and pence. And I think that's what you've latched onto here, and you've picked up, I think, on something that I think has become less emphasised within the Liberal Party in recent years, and that is the things other than pounds, shillings and pence. It's become in many ways the party that thinks it's put on earth to get into government and fix up Labor's financial mess, and that's important for sure, but there's more important things, and people like you and other good people, many actually within the Liberal Party now, recognise that. So congratulations to you all. To Tom Kenyon and Bob McCoskey from New Zealand Family First. I don't know if he's still here, but I've been looking at the work they've been doing, and I think it's terrific, particularly online, with their anti-woke agenda and so forth. So that's marvellous. And it was great to hear from Deepa and Christopher about, I still say the Great Strait of South Australia. That was where I came as a POM in 1989. I lived there very happily for 4 years, and I've still got a deep affection for the place. And I'm not surprised that this movement is so strong there, and it's begun there, and let it flourish throughout the land. I'm also deeply grateful to you, Lyle, because you actually know that I come here with a quite fundamentally different agenda to you. The Menzies Research Centre, which I was executive director of until last year, and to which I'm still attached, is affiliated to the Liberal Party, and I spent 10 years there working to encourage the Liberal Party to get back to its fundamental values, which were espoused so well by Robert Menzies. And one of those was really from the founding of the party. Many of you will know the history of the Liberal Party. It was founded in 1944, and its purpose was to unite the very disparate parties on the centre-right. That's what it did. And it did it by coming together around ideas, around the fundamental principles of liberalism, as Robert Menzies was so skilled at articulating. And central to that was the gospel. Central to that was the gospel of Christ. And you may have come across, if you haven't, I recommend it to you, a book which we published by David First Roberts called God and Menzies. And in there he shows that the Liberal Party's fundamental principles, the equal dignity of every person, are deeply embedded in the gospel message. And that Robert Menzies used to have no hesitation in using the language of the Bible, quoting from the Bible. He was very often seen speaking in churches and amongst other faith groups around the country, because he recognised that was those fundamental Judeo-Christian principles the bedrock of what we believe makes a good society, makes a strong society and a civil society. And I think that remains. And so it is to my great regret that many of you here will probably we already heard a couple of people out themselves as former members of the Liberal Party. That makes me deeply sad. I know why that is, and I feel for it. We're speaking today on the 11th anniversary of the election of the Tony Abbott government. Tony Abbott was the last Prime Minister in this country to be elected on a strong reforming agenda based on strong principles. He was also the last Prime Minister in this country to be elected with a substantial majority. And I don't think those two things are coincidental. I think if you come with strong policy, if you come with clear ideas for how to make this a better country, not just for us, but for our children and our children's children, and beyond that, I think you will win the support of the Australian people. So I very much appreciate what you're doing here, although I'd very much like to encourage some of you back to the Liberal Party, because for every good person that leaves the Liberal Party, the balance of power shifts more towards this, what is, I think, a very small it's certainly a minority within the party who don't fully share our values. So, but I wish you all the best, and I'll do everything I can to support you in your endeavours. I must say I'm blown away what you've done already. You know, in the brief few years since you were brought back into existence, you've managed, as we've seen today in the ACT and in Queensland, actually to get some endorsed candidates, which is sort of fundamental to what politics is about, right? But the Liberal Party in New South Wales has failed to do that completely, the elections that we're fighting next week. So I understand fully your frustration and wish you all the very best. Today, I just wanted to share with you, I started out by thinking I'd share with you some thoughts from my recent trip to Europe, which lasted many months. I was fortunate enough to be a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute, along with my wife, Rebecca, in Hungary, which is a very fine, it's one of actually a number of fine conservative institutes in Hungary where they're really trying to further the kind of policy aims that many of you, all of you, I guess, would support, and particularly to project those out of Hungary. Hungary gets a very bad press for a lot of reasons, certainly in the woke press, which is virtually all of the mainstream press these days, where it's considered to be it's often described as an authoritarian country with a hard right agenda. And what it boils down to is that it's a country that has some very firm views on immigration. It wants immigration, but only insofar as there's a particular need, a labour shortage or whatever. It also is, will welcome people who are genuine claim for refugee status, but only those, as the United Nations rules apply, that come from the neighbouring country. You're not supposed to, you go to the next safe country, you don't sort of continue on. So they've taken a very large number of people from Ukraine in the last couple of years, and so it's not a country that is totally opposed to migration, but they do believe very strongly, and this is a feature of Hungary going back centuries, in the importance of maintaining their own cultural identity as Hungarians. And they've erected a massive fence, which I went down to visit, on the border with Serbia, which is not impenetrable. You'd think it would be. The sort of razor wire, two rows of it, electric fences, cameras on every corner. The people smugglers still try to get people across with ladders over this dangerous wire and land in the middle. They're so desperate to get people up from Serbia, which is not in the EU, into the EU, because from then they can go on and go further north. The Hungarians have taken a stand against this and have said, no, we're going to keep that border clean. Much as John Howard did, we will decide who comes to this country in the circumstances in which they come. For their trouble keeping unregistered migrants out of Europe, the European Union is fining them €1 million a day. They hate them that much because they've gone against this ideology, which is firm now within the EU and, of course, many countries, that migration is just a good thing. Diversity is a good thing. It makes our countries better. Today I thought I'd start with talking about the title of my speech, which is Rethinking Immigration. And I'll look at Hungary as an example. I'll say first that I am myself an immigrant, and we've heard from two very fine Australians today who are migrants. Because migration in itself has been very positive for this country. Indeed, this country would not be what it is without the energy of migrants. It would be a shadow of its current self, I believe, without the enthusiasm that every migrant gives, those who come believing this is a better country. And if on arrival it turns out not to be, they're going to make it so. And it's that energy from migrants which we've seen over the generations. I think right from the arrival of indigenous people all those thousands of years ago, to be honest, they were the first ones to start about scratching a living from a difficult country, and it continues on through. We are a country of migrants, just as the United States are. And what we and the United States, Canada and other similar countries, New Zealand, have managed to do is to create a strong country with its own sense of identity, our own shared sense of identity, our own shared sense of democratic values, which every migrant who comes, almost without exception, has been able to win over to. I'm fond of telling the story of when I went to have a haircut, and there was a Korean lady cutting my hair who could barely speak English, and it was 2 days after the Melbourne Cup, and she said to me, "What horse you back?" And I thought, she's an Australian, she gets it, you know, she gets the basic rules of Australia, that you bet on the Melbourne Cup, that you define a fridge as something with beer in it, and so on. You know, these are obviously, I don't know whether these are in the citizenship test, but they certainly should be. Along with some practical lessons in shearing a sheep. I think you shouldn't be able to become a citizen of this country unless you can shear a sheep, but my wife disagrees with me on that topic. But I digress, except to say that if the people coming here understand what it means to be Australian, they understand not only the rights that come from being Australian, but the obligations. They understand what it means, the duties that apply to citizenship, as well as anything else. And they understand, most importantly of all, that the most important thing that defines them once they come here is that they are Australian. It's not where they come from, it's not anything minor like the colour of their skin or their gender or anything else like that. We all need to be Australian. So we need to keep that. So if you look at the limits of migration, the problems of migration, we can see that alive and well in Europe. We can see it in my home country of Great Britain, where we've witnessed this country this summer in Great Britain, something I can only describe as ethnic tension, ethnic violence erupting on the streets. If this was happening in Sarajevo, the British press would be calling it that, but it's happening on the streets of Britain. They are in a terrible state. And the question is why? Well, the proportion of people who are migrants in Britain, you know, migrant being somebody who was born overseas, is around 16 to 17%. In Australia, it's more than 30%. In fact, we have the highest proportion of migrants of any country in the OECD, with the exception of Luxembourg. But Luxembourg, I say, doesn't count, because the reason people come to Australia is to make their fortune. They go to Luxembourg with its wonderful tax laws to keep their fortune. So it's quite a different thing. But we've done that. Not only that, but I strongly believe that we are the most successful migration-centred country in the world. I can think of no other that it has so few tensions. And where we come here and you don't hear, for instance, as you do in American, people talking about themselves as Cuban American or Mexican American or whatever. Here we put the Australian bit first, as we are now, but things, of course, will change dramatically. So we have to hold on to that thing. What is driving migration, or the instinct to encourage migration? Well, I've already mentioned one, I think, which is the later development, which is this ideological belief that there is something a little bit rotten in our own country, and by bringing diversity from around the world, we improve the joint. I think that's utterly mistaken. but it's led to an open borders policy and in the EU, and it's led to a profound change in the United Kingdom in the last 15 to 20 years, really since the Blair government, which introduced this, where there's been a doubling in the number of migrants, albeit, as I say, still a small base compared to here. But the breakdown of cohesion, migration from when it began in the late 50s, early 60s in Britain was largely, almost all, from Commonwealth countries, which included the West Indies, it included India, it included Pakistan. And those people came to Britain, I think, at least 3/4 of the way there in understanding what makes Britain tick, because they'd had a British education. They understood the importance of the Westminster system, of democracy, of liberalism, in respecting your neighbours. And out of that great cohort, that's been enormously beneficial to Britain, I believe. But it changed when that sort of idea that people who come to Britain have to be capable of succeeding in Britain by adopting the very basic national principles and the idea that they could come and do whatever they wanted and you could have Sharia law and whatever. Things started to break down, and particularly with the loss of control of borders. This is so important. You know, what John Howard did in 2001 was so important for Australia. Without keeping control of your borders, you quickly lose control of migration and the trust of the people. So that's exactly what's happened in Britain. In the last 3 years, 120,000 people have come illegally by small boat across the Channel. And these are dangerous journeys. People are dying along the way. They're being crushed in these little boats because they're piling too many people in them, quite apart from the danger of sinking. And these people have arrived in Britain, and Britain has had to do something with them, and they've been housed in hotels which have been commandeered around the country, 350 of these hotels, all around the country, everywhere except in London, of course, where hotels are full and too expensive. They've been put around in places like Weymouth or Southport. So, you know, I was surprised. Many of you might know the beautiful little town of Weymouth in Dorset, heart of Thomas Hardy country. And I was thinking, why a riot in Weymouth? But that's what it comes down to. The town has been ripped apart by taking over one of the large hotels and turning it into essentially a little mini Christmas island. And people are sick of this. They don't want to lose the golf course they used to be able to use. They don't want to use the swimming pool. They don't want to have their wedding reception bookings cancelled because this hotel's been taken over by migrants. And that is at the root, I believe, of the current problem around migration in Britain, lack of control. So we have to deal with that. There is, I think, a longer standing and legitimate and still legitimate reason for migration, and that revolves around the economy, particularly the need that we need to maintain a population, and a growing population probably, for economic growth on the model that we've had, and without that we start to go backwards in prosperity. That's what's driven migration in this country since the beginning. I think it's part of the way the Treasury looks at this. It's part of the way most of politics looks at this. And it is quite legitimate. But I think I'm beginning to say, well, there are limits to that too. And here's why. All lies in the falling birth rate. We know there's a falling birth rate in this country. We know we've been below replacement rate for decades in this country. And that we've been able to make up for that to a large extent by immigration. So immigration has been a stopgap measure for the falling birth rate. But here's the thing, over the summer, or over the European summer, sorry, it was winter here, but I was having another summer, I read a very challenging book by a chap called Paul Morland. And the book's called No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children. And this showed to me starkly that the falling birth rate issue is not just a problem in this country, it's a problem in most of the world right now. Even in places you don't even think of. And at the start of the book, Paul quotes 4 newspaper headlines, or 3, sorry, to emphasize this point. Number 1, and this is slightly ironic, Russia running out of single-use soldiers. Russia has one of the lowest birth rates in the world right now, but I think its problem is more Vladimir Putin than that. But anyway, Number 2, UK running low on fuel, truck drivers. And then number 3, staffing shortage continues to disrupt Amsterdam Schiphol. Oh yes, and there is a 4th. China's factories are wrestling with labour shortages. So this problem that we have here continually of a shortage of labour and wages being too high, skill shortages, that is affecting almost the entire globe. Even Thailand, for instance, Thailand has a birth rate now much lower than Australia's. They're going to run out of people quicker than we are. China certainly does, but there's one of the reasons for that, obviously, is their one-child policy. But so are countries like India, for instance, where the birth rate is slowing down, to the extent that there is now a huge migration from southern India, where the birth rate has stayed high, to north India, which is more economically prosperous, in order to feed that gap. So every country in the world that is being successful and yet has a low birth rate is trying to get more migrants to keep the place running. So obviously this is going to reach a point where it runs out. There are some exceptions, and Morland's book, which I commend to you, goes through these exceptions in some detail to explain why. One is Israel, where they're bucking the trend, and obviously the Orthodox Jews in Israel do have more children than the general population, but it's more than that. It's more than just religion. It's more than because all Jews fall into that category. So the birth rate is falling, and Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is one of the few people that's addressed this head on and said, we will be a pro-natalist government and we will put in policies to encourage people to have babies and build families. And he's done this largely through tax breaks, very generous tax breaks that last a lifetime if you overcome a threshold of a certain number of children. And they have worked up to a point. So Hungary's birth rate has increased from what was a very low point. Hungary has lost, Hungarian population has gone down from about 12 million to 10 million, by the way, in the last 30 years. But they've begun to address that, although not yet to replacement level. So plainly that tax break is a help, but there are other things. And Morland looks at the causes for the drop in population growth and says every time you think you've nailed it, you find 10 exceptions. There are many reasons. It's hard exactly to figure out why, but it's something, much of it is cultural, I believe, but there are some things that we can deal with. So here is my challenge. Here is my challenge to you as Family First. You are people, as we've heard today, you're very much a values-based party. Many of you from a Christian background, not all, but many, and you bring that with you, and that's terrific because we need much more of that in politics. But that is not enough. You're playing in an increasingly large field of minor parties and independents who I would say are broadly conservative, certainly socially conservative. So what is it that's going to make your offering different and distinctive from, say, Family First, from, say, One Nation, where many One Nation people who I know and love would be on board with you with much of your agenda, certainly on the need to protect families and the need to preserve our Judeo-Christian culture. And the same would be true of many of the people who voted for Clive Palmer's UAP. I've come to know a few of those people through various networks, including Ralph Babbitt, who I think is doing an excellent job in the Senate. So what is it that your single offering is? And here is why it's important, not just for the electoral success of Family First, but for the future of this country, if we're going, as I suspect we are, to the way much of the democracies, and many of the democracies in much of the else of the world are going, towards a more fractured political system, where a conservative government can only come to power if it becomes a coalition of vaguely like-minded groups on the centre-right. This is happening in Finland, it's happening in Sweden, it's happening much closer to home in New Zealand. And I must say, in each of those three cases, to the extent that I've studied them, I believe that the coalition is stronger than any of its individual parts. So I think this has been good. I think what it's done is it's taken people with conservative values but with different emphasis or come from different areas together and say, well, we're going to be in government together. What are the central things we can agree on? And in doing that, it's given them a lot of focus and a lot of direction. And in all three countries, I think they have strong and promising conservative governments for it. But we're in that world, so once you are in the position, and I admire Jack for his vision, once you are in the position of the Greens with that degree of vote and you're in a position to form coalition, what do you bring? So I think, just running out of time, but I will just hammer home this point, that I think you should look at being not just the pro-family party, but very specifically the pro-baby party. We want to see more babies in the world. I, as a grandfather, would certainly like to see more babies, and I'm glad I don't have to be the one to be the primary carer, but I can just enjoy the secondary benefits. But anyway, the best reason for becoming a father, in my opinion, is it's the first step on the ladder to becoming a grandfather. But how do we do this? Well, as I say, there is no single simple policy solution to this. In fact, there are many things that are beyond what politics can do, but politics can certainly start changing the narrative and improving. I think we have to come with a pro-natalist lens across every area of policy that you look at. I think, and this may come as a challenge, but I think many of the issues which we've mentioned today, which are very important issues, in which we all get very passionate, I think we will start seeing as issues that follow from this pro-baby position when we look at it. Obviously, what we've heard today particularly about abortion and about the treatment of babies that are born alive is vital, and they were, I thought, quite stunning statistics that we saw today, that essentially abortion is the biggest cause of death in this country. That's tragic and heartbreaking. But it applies to that. It applies too, I think, in the area of this weird transgender right thing, because if we confuse people about whether they're men or women, and particularly if we allow, medical intervention that will stop, which will end a woman's right, a woman's ability to have a baby, is ended by some surgery or chemical treatment that happens when they're teens, that is tragic. That's all leading to a decline of the family. And just, I meant to say earlier, that statistics, that surveys consistently show that when you ask women how many children they want, how many women want children, how many children they want, it far exceeds the number they actually have. So people actually do want more children. They actually do, and including and especially university-educated women, which may be counterintuitive. So we need to remove every barrier in public policy to them doing that. We need to look at childcare and how it favours women who want to go out to work and leave their children with a childcare centre, and disfavours those who wish to stay at home and look after their kids. It disfavours grandparents who, the number of grandparents who take care of kids now has dramatically declined since we increased subsidies to childcare. So we need to look at that, how we ensure that there is choice and people are not disadvantaged. We need to look at housing policy, how we build more houses. We need to look at the kind of houses we're building. So if we're stuck, as I think we are, with a lot more high-rise living and crowded areas, why don't we insist that developers also make these buildings child-friendly? They build playgrounds, they build any other facilities that will allow people with families to live there comfortably. It applies across almost every policy issue when you think about it, the way about our taxation system, our welfare system, our energy system, everything in those spaces, each one of these, education being another one. We don't want to discourage people from going on and taking up higher education and doing the best they can, but it's closing the window for having children. It's delaying the point at which delaying family formation. We all know of many women in the late 20s and 30s who already realising that it's the clock is ticking. So what can we do? So in the briefly, I just wrap up and close at that point and to say that I think it's important that you become a distinctive party, not just another one railing against the woke nonsense which is all around us and despairing that things are not as good as they used to be, but actually calling out for a firm framework for a policy moving forward that will give you a lens on everything you look at and hopefully make this a bigger and better country. Thank you.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for that. You are someone who comes obviously from the journalism world, but the think tank world, and you've come with a challenge, a practical challenge to us, and from a policy perspective, and I really appreciate that, and I think that's something we can absolutely take on board. You've reminded us about the problems of immigration, the tension that's occurred in parts of Europe and your home country, and obviously we don't want to see that here in Australia, and hopefully in Family First we can model good immigration as Christopher and Deepa are doing so well. I really appreciate you giving up your time today. Just before that, you did give it another little challenge at the start, and I appreciate you raising the obvious tension that we are in different parties, and there has been a splintering in the centre-right in Australia, and that is a shame. I'm sure Robert Menzies would not have liked to have seen this. I never believed that this is a either-or, but a both-and strategy. And I think for the moment we're going to need parties like Family First, but I know many good people who've remained in the Liberal Party, some very dear friends of mine right around the country, and I'm supportive of them, they're supportive of what we're doing, and the cause is the cause. And hopefully in time we can together be salt and light and bring our nation back to a place where we're not telling policy lies to each other in the public square. And so that's an important project. We're not here to... We hope we can fold our tent one day, but I think for the moment we're going to have to keep going. So Nick, thank you so much for giving your time. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining Nick today. We've got a very small token of appreciation, but we do really appreciate what you've done and contributed. Please thank Nick Cater. Thank you. God bless.